friends. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Our global climate crisis has an economic context that is rarely addressed in the media. One book that has explained that relationship brilliantly is Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal, the Political Economy of Saving the Planet. This is by Noam Chomsky and Robert Pollin. Daniel Ellsberg called this a survival manual for civilization, and we are most fortunate to have economist Robert Pollin with us today to explain the roots of the climate crisis and the solution in a global Green New Deal. Robert Pollin is a distinguished professor of economics and also co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute, called PERI, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is among the world's leading progressive economists and was listed by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 100 leading global thinkers for 2013. Dr. Pollin, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And I'd like to start by asking, just with the book, that the climate crisis and the global Green New Deal, could you tell us briefly what is that climate crisis that we need to talk about?
Sure. Well, basically, the climate crisis is the fact that temperatures have been rising persistently for about 40 years. The average global temperature has been rising, say, for 80 years, but not persistently. It's been rising persistently roughly since about 1980. And when I say rising, what we do is we measure the average temperature compared with what's called the pre-industrial period. So compared with the period before 1850, let's say. And right now, as of this past year, the average temperature relative to 1850 is about 1.2 degrees Celsius above that pre-industrial average. Now, according to climate science, which I am not a climate scientist, but anything that if we get a average global temperature above 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're at 1.2 now. If we get above 1.5, you will see an intensification of the phenomena that we're already experiencing, which is massive heat waves, intensifying floods, wild swings in temperatures, droughts. I mean, you have this experience in India and Pakistan the last 2 summers where the average temperature, I'll express it in Fahrenheit, the average temperature is over 115 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, with humidity, it's basically unlivable. Mm-hmm. And these are places where hundreds of millions of people live.
Right.
So that's it. And we are seeing the impacts of this with respect to heat waves, droughts, temperatures rising, floods. All of those things are only going to get worse unless we can stabilize the average temperature.
Okay. Now, the other thing is this is all happening within an economic framework, which you have described very, very well here. And I need to get a little information about that. Could you explain why we keep pumping oil in this situation? And what is that economic system that is driving this so that we're not solving the problems?
Well, we live in a capitalist economy in the United States and basically globally. capitalist economy, the basic premise is capitalist business owners are in business to make profits. And the way that they can make profits is what drives the system. Now, in the case of the fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels to produce energy is the primary cause of the rise in the global average temperature, which is to say the primary cause of climate change, burning fossil fuels to produce energy. Now, since we know that, and we've known it for decades, then the question might be, well, why don't we just stop burning fossil fuels to produce energy? One reason is our economic structure is geared towards relying on fossil fuels to transport ourselves, to light homes, to run equipment, and so forth. And we don't switch out of it because there are gigantic profits that fossil fuel companies make by selling us the fossil fuels that we need to produce energy. So, sure, if we could envision an economic arrangement now in which there was no profit to be acquired by burning fossil fuels to produce energy, we could solve the climate crisis much more readily.
Right. And so the other factor might be that this is, as you suggested, a kind of global reach of these of the system at this point. And then you have two things. You have denial from those corporations for a long time and continuing, and the other is a certain range of solutions to the problem. In the meantime, they keep getting contracts to pump more oil. But could you tell us briefly then, like, well, they're not going to stop because of the profit and which is driving it, but what are some of their solutions to the problem, like the limitations, carbon caps, and things like that?
So, well, the fossil fuel companies are obviously in business to make money. They don't particularly care about fossil fuels. They care about making money,
Right.
but they're making massive profits. You know, last year, the six biggest global oil companies made $200 billion
Right.
in profits, and they obviously don't want to see that go away. The types of solutions that the companies themselves are proposing are ways through which they can continue to burn fossil fuels. The most prominent is so-called carbon capture technology,
Yes.
whereby you just keep burning the fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy, but we have technologies that will capture the carbon and do something with it. The basic idea is that you bury it, you capture it, and that you bury it underground for all time's sake. Those technologies have been discussed now for decades. There's obviously a massive incentive on the part of the companies to make these things work, but meanwhile, none of them work at all. None of them have been proven to work at any kind of scale. This is after decades of attempting. And even if they were, quote, successful, the idea of burying carbon underground forever and assuming that none of it would ever leak up is a big stretch. So there's only one carbon capture technology that is known to work and is known to be safe, and that is planting trees. And that because trees and other plants absorb carbon. For that matter, in the ocean, fish absorb carbon. That could be another carbon sink. But those things are viable technologies, but they cannot counteract sufficiently if we continue to burn fossil fuels. And that therefore, what we need to do, assuming we want to get the benefits of having energy to run machines, is to have alternative sources of energy, mainly renewable energy, clean energy that does not generate the carbon emissions that cause climate change.
Right. Another thing that since you mentioned the carbon capture thing, another aspect of this, it seems from here to be very much within the system concept, is that there are public taxpayer subsidies for these technologies that simply do not work. But you're making money out of it anyway, so why not keep it up? But another thing is that the public, I think, is largely unaware that they are subsidizing these technologies that don't work while allowing the continuation of oil production and just all the other things, big agriculture, lots of things that contribute to.
Well, so the carbon capture technology, it's true, is subsidized, but more generally, burning fossil fuels to produce energy with any technology is subsidized globally.
Yes.
The level of the subsidy is about 1.5% of all economic activity in the whole world, global GDP. Now you may say, well, 1.5% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually gigantic. We're talking about an $80 trillion economy. So 1.5% is about $1 trillion a year pumped into supporting the ongoing consumption of fossil fuels.
Yes, and very hard on the planet and on everybody around the planet. And another thing is that they like to offer sort of feel-good remedies for the situation rather than attending to the actual problems, so that at these big international conferences like COP28 and IPCC and so on, they are able to resist actual change, it seems. Is that true?
Yeah, it was interesting at the last. They have, yes, as you mentioned, these annual conferences, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC.
Yeah.
They have these conferences, and the last one was in Abu Dhabi, so that's an oil-producing country. And the year before it was in Egypt, which is not itself oil-producing, but is very closely associated.
Right.
And so actually in the last one, it was considered a big, quote, breakthrough in that for the first time in writing, the participants at the conference acknowledged that burning fossil fuels to produce energy is contributing to climate change. We've known this for a half century. They put in one sentence which acknowledges, and this was considered a major
major breakthrough.
Yeah. Now, given that they did acknowledge it, then they of course say, well, that therefore what we need to do is develop these so-called carbon capture technologies that will enable us to continue burning fossil fuels to produce energy. So that's how far away they are from seriously addressing the problem. That doesn't mean that other people, I mean, the people who care about the planet themselves, their families, the rest of the world, we have to move ahead and develop policies, programs, movements, and there have been important developments despite what has come out of this, the global UN kind of thing.
Yes. Before we leave this, because I'm anxious to get into your the global Green New Deal, which is the real substance of the book, that I would like to ask that governments sort of capitulate to these industries, and the industries behind all of this seem to have superseded the nation state in many ways. They're enormously powerful and can dictate policy or hamper policy development and so on. Is that true? I'd just like your input on that.
Well, certainly that's what they're trying, and certainly they do have enormous power, but it is not absolute.
Okay.
And so that we do have, we have seen important developments in behalf of a climate control, climate stabilization, saving the planet agenda. Even in the United States, I want to give credit. The Biden administration
Yes.
passed, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act,
Right.
but it was primarily a measure to subsidize investments in alternative energy. There was some support in that for carbon capture technology, but
Yes.
most of the money is going to support um, renewable solar energy, wind energy, energy efficiency, battery technology, the kinds of things that will enable us to move off of dependency on fossil fuels.
Right. I understand what you're saying there. And on that IRA thing specifically, my issue with that very quickly is that the way it was written at first was altered considerably by the resistance of this sort
Oh,
of
yeah.
right wing in the Congress. And that's what I meant by the disproportionate power of these.
Oh, well, the history of this inflation or so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which passed in 2022.
Yeah.
I mean, really, to give credit, it really came out of the so-called Green New Deal movement
Yes. Yeah,
in the
absolutely.
United
Yes.
States. So you had this resolution that was initially introduced by Senator Markey, my senator in Massachusetts, and Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, called the Green New Deal, endorsed by lots and lots of people. And of course, they were picking up on the movement. So it's really not the politicians, but the real organizers, the Green New Deal Network, of which I've worked with that group. It's outstanding. It's a lot of different groups. So they came out with a proposal, and then Bernie Sanders picked up on it, and his is a somewhat watered down version of what the Green New Deal Network came up with. Then the Biden administration took what Bernie Sanders had done and watered down that further, and that was called Build Back Better. It was still
Yeah.
a very substantive, important initiative. That was opposed. Now, of course, every single Republican was opposed, but even a couple of Democrats
Right.
were opposed, including Senator Manchin of
Yes.
West
West
Virginia.
Virginia.
So ultimately, somehow the Biden administration was able to convince this recalcitrant Senator Manchin from West Virginia, who thinks he's representing the best interests of the coal community in West Virginia. That's not true, but he thinks that he happens to be in the coal business himself. Anyway, the version that passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, is far from what was initially introduced, but even still, it is an important positive development.
I understand. I understand. From there, I wanted to give more time to this, in fact, than we're going to have, but I want to put a lot of emphasis on your global Green New Deal idea in this book and why that's so important. I read that myself as you don't have options. We have to go in this direction. We can't be goofing off in the future. But would you please tell us what this is, the global Green New Deal, and why it is so crucial?
Okay. Well, conceptually, it's very, very simple. Details complicated, but conceptually, it's very simple. Which is that I totally agree with you. It's we don't have any choice.
Right.
I mean, if we're going to believe in climate science, and if we don't believe in it, that's pretty dangerous. But let's assume that we believe in climate science and that what climate scientists are telling us is true, that therefore we have no choice but to, as a first major step, to eliminate fossil fuels as a source of energy. It can't happen in 1 year, but we have to phase it out over, let's say, the next 20 years. Now, so that's step one. Now, step two is if we're going to do this and we're going to do it in a way that is anyway politically viable and more importantly, fair, just, we have to do it in a way that also equally advances well-being of working people, low-income people, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And so that's why I actually like the term Green New Deal. I didn't come up with the term. I like it because it captures the spirit of the 1930s New Deal under
Yes.
Franklin Roosevelt, which came up with a way to address the uh, economic depression in a way that advanced general well-being and raised living standards and opportunity for working people and the poor. And so I think that the idea of a global Green New Deal is one in which we combine a solution to the climate crisis while also advancing equality and social justice.
Okay, and can you give us an idea of the outline of the plan itself, like what it will accomplish in terms of one of the big issues with resisting is, oh my gosh, we're going to lose millions of jobs and so on. And you have pointed out, on the contrary, it will
Right.
create millions of
Yes.
jobs. There's a community capacity to the thing, and the financing, you go into great detail in your book, and it is really very carefully thought out. Would you give us some information in
So
our
just
last 10 minutes?
briefly, well, and I could do it in the context of something that is now front and center in the US presidential campaign,
Yeah.
which is fracking in Pennsylvania. So the idea of that the Republicans are attacking Kamala Harris on is that she said that she was against fracking. Fracking is a way of extracting natural gas from relatively shallow sites, and it's become a very lucrative operation, especially in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, so what if we were to say, but on the other hand, it means burning fossil fuels to produce energy, and also leaks the actual production of the natural gas, the extraction through fracking, leaks methane gas, which is extremely toxic, and that therefore it's even worse than burning coal. So, if we were to think about a Green New Deal, creating jobs in Pennsylvania to get to zero emissions, to eliminate fossil fuel burning in, let's say, 25 years, you're going to generate about 125,000 jobs per year in the state of Pennsylvania because you have to build this green alternative energy system. You have to build out the solar, the wind farms, the charging stations. You have to advance energy efficiency. You got to make buildings more efficient. You're going to increase public transportation. All of that creates jobs. And it's about 125,000 jobs by some research I've done with others. Meanwhile, yes, we will get rid of fracking, but not tomorrow. We're not going to shut it down completely tomorrow. We're going to phase it out. And there's only about 4,000 fracking jobs in the whole state. Then we can phase them out on an annual basis such that we're going to see, in the hundreds, we're going to create about 125,000 new jobs, but then we are going to phase out the fracking jobs little by little. And on top of that, the jobs that are lost, we need to guarantee those workers alternative job opportunities, maybe in the green economy, maybe in other things, but we guarantee that. That's what I have tried to outline, not just for Pennsylvania, for the whole US,
Right.
indeed, for a lot of
World.
other countries. I've done the similar kind of modeling.
Right, right. That's a very important point and very well explained in your book, that this actually creates an abundance of jobs, but they're also beneficial jobs. They're jobs that benefit communities and countries and the globe. And that's an extremely important point, I think. There are some other, there's an example, the German example that you explained, I think, in your book about a community ownership. There's that capacity in your plan also. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those ideas?
So, there are lots of what we would call side benefits that they're not, I don't mean to make them seem small. Let's say co-benefits of this transition out of fossil fuel energy. One of them is public health. Obviously, we're going to
Right.
get rid of air pollution, the major source of air pollution. So another one is that it's going to create opportunities for new kinds of ownership, small scale investment, community ownership, as opposed to having the, as you were talking about, gigantic fossil fuel companies and utilities, electric utilities, deciding everything about our
Right.
future. You know, you can have a small scale community solar installation that the community itself operates. In fact, one of the best examples of that is taking place in remote rural communities in Alaska, where they are saving money because it's for them to get fossil fuels. It comes in diesel fuel comes, it has to come by airplane often. Alternatively, you can have a solar and wind combination there, and the community owns it. They make all the benefits of ownership. They make decisions collectively. The other example that you mentioned that's in our book is this, you know, a similar case of 100% renewable energy within a municipality in Germany. And they're running it just fine. And keep in mind, this is Germany. Germany does not get all the sunshine, let's say, that
That's right.
Arizona gets or that Morocco gets. You know, it is a kind of cold, cloudy climate, but nevertheless, you get more than enough renewable energy
Yes.
to 100% run the machines that you need to run.
Right. So you have pointed out the important things there, that we could transition to renewable energy now. It's not going to take 100 years to do that. So that is sort of propaganda that keeps coming out that, oh, it's going to take forever. The other one is it's going to be so expensive. We just have a few minutes left, but you go into detail about how this would be financed, and it's really sensible. Could you tell us a bit about it?
Well, first of all, let me just say that even today, to generate 1 kilowatt of electricity from wind power or solar energy is cheaper than any fossil fuel alternative. Cheaper than burning coal, cheaper than burning natural gas, or for that matter, running nuclear energy. It
Yes.
is the low-cost alternative in all regions of the world. And so, you know, keep that in mind so that even if you don't care at all about the climate crisis, which you should, but even if you didn't and you just said, well, we're capitalists, what's the cheapest way to generate energy? Renewable is now the cheapest, so it should be the best investment opportunity. And what I've worked on for several years now is to just envision, well, how much would it really cost to actually produce 100, to have a system by 2050 in which every unit of energy comes from renewables. And my estimate is that it would take about 2.5% of all economic activity of global GDP every year to do that. And again, on the one hand, 2.5% of GDP sounds small, but it tells us that, you know, 97.5% of GDP can be doing a lot of anything else. But we do need to put the 2.5% of GDP into renewable energy. And and what I go through in the book and elsewhere are ways to raise that 2.5% of GDP, which, you know, in today's global economy, that is going to be about $2.5 trillion. Now, the thing I mentioned at the outset, close to the outset, we are subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of 1.5% of GDP. So if you were just to get rid of that subsidy, you're more than halfway to paying for the entire annual expenditure of building a clean energy system.
Right. And this is really important. I do hope people will read this book to get into this. It's presented in a way that all of us can digest it, but also very persuasive with the facts. And so you have covered that it is very doable right now. We have the technology, we have everything. We can make this switch, and we can do this globally. It will help everybody. It will help developing nations and so on. And the other is that you have indicated very well that financing this is not the big deal that we're often advertised as it's a big deal or something. It isn't. We can do it. And you just need to move some money around that's going in maybe the wrong places at this time. And then the other thing is that it will create millions of jobs. I'm afraid we're about out of time, and I wish we could go on for much longer. You're very, very informative. But I need to say that I really appreciate this book. I hope you're going to keep right on writing and talking about this and get the word out there to people and persuade them.
Thank you.
Dr. Pollin, thank you very much for joining us today. And
Thank you
this
very much for
fabulous.
having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thanks.